You're listening to Online Pet Health Podcasts with Dr. Megan Kelly. Continuing education for veterinarian rehabilitation therapists. Learn more at onlinepethealth.com.
Hey Vet Rehabbers, welcome to the Veterinary Rehabilitation Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Kelly, and I'm joined by Adrian Lock. He's CEO of Pulsevet. Adrian, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for including me.
So this is one of my Behind the Rehab Products podcasts, and I really love to do this because I really love to hear about the people behind the products that serve our community. So Adrian, won't you tell me about Pulsevet, how you got involved and how you got into shockwave therapy?
Yeah, certainly. So I have a background in medical device and kind of biotech products, sales and marketing, and I had gone to work for a company called Shockwave in 2006, which was a shockwave therapy company focused on the human market, but also had a small vet division that was doing quite nicely. I had no background at that point in veterinary medicine, but about a year after I started with Shockwave, the guy who had been running the vet business moved back to Switzerland, where we made him our international VP, and we decided it made more sense for me to start running the vet business at that point. And then about a year after that, the company decided to sell off the vet business. So they were trying to raise capital for a human diabetic foot ulcer study, and this was in 2008, and it was hard to find money, so they decided to sell off the vet business. And a couple of individuals came in, and I met with them and decided that I wanted to be included in that. But at that point, I'd been working on the vet side, really enjoyed working in veterinary medicine. I'm a passionate animal lover myself. And it has just worked out really well from there. So that was in 2009, we formally split off from Shockwave, formed Pulsevet. One of the things that was really appealing to me was is that what I've seen kind of in industry wide is that frequently, if a company has a vet division, a human focused company has a vet division, whatever money they get out of the vet division, they end up putting into human research, or it doesn't go back to the vet business so much. So I saw this as a really good opportunity for us to take the revenue that we were generating out of the vet business and focus it back into veterinary research. So at the time, we were primarily equine focused company, and we still are to this day, but we wanted to do more research onto the small animal side and really start to promote it and aggressively do supportive clinical research around shockwave therapy in various veterinary indications.
So you obviously now joined the new people that started it, and now how big is the business? How many people?
So we're still a relatively small company. We have about 15 employees, a fairly small sales and marketing organization of about 4 people. We have a separate office in Japan. There's an interesting side note there, but the regulatory approval process in Japan is quite a bit harder for veterinary medicine. It's more similar to a human medical approval. And we had to establish a business there, a separate little business there. So we have a small subsidiary office in Japan. But otherwise, it's primarily a small sales and marketing organization based here in the States. We do have one international business manager that's based in Europe. We also have 5 operations people that basically do all of the device assembly, manufacturing, repairs, trode refurbishments, things like that in-house.
Yeah, so that word trode, it's something I just learned because I didn't know that was the handheld device. It's called a trode. So when I was researching for this, I was like, trode, I've never heard of that word. But that's probably because I've never actually used a shockwave therapy machine before. So I've seen it being used at trade shows, and they've used it on me. But I've never actually seen it being used on animals. So not many people here in South Africa have them. There are a few sort of equine chiropractors, I think, that use them, and a few vets that use them, but it's not very common yet. Like it is, I think in America, it's quite a common form of treatment, right?
Yeah, actually, globally, it's quite common in various pockets. So the U.S. and Canada is quite strong. Most of Europe is strong. As I mentioned, Japan actually has a strong business for us. We're expanding into South America, and I do need to find a distribution channel into South Africa. So whoever's listening, if you're interested, I think that's a good potential market opportunity for us as well.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, it's one of the fastest growing veterinary rehabilitation fields. I mean, here in South Africa, we've grown over the last 3 years so quickly. So I think that you might have some people that'll be interested in shockwave therapy. So for any of you that are listening, you know, anyone that is interested in distributing Pulsevet's products, please just give me a shout, and I will forward your email onto Adrian. So Adrian, tell me a little bit about the mission of Pulsevet. You know, we all do, you know, we do what we do because of a passion that we have. So like, what is your guys' mission?
Well, I think, as I alluded to a little bit before, that for us, I'm a believer in the technology, right? So, back from when I was just doing human research, I see that there's a true benefit. And what I want to do is sort of bring awareness about the technology. And there are various kinds of shockwave therapy, and some work a lot better than others. And I think part of the challenge for us is that there are other devices out there that may work for some indications, but they don't have the same kind of breadth of applicability. So a lot of the research that we've done, whether it's been for tendon and ligament healing, bone healing, some of the areas we're looking at now is combining shockwave therapy with stem cell therapy and seeing if there's potentially synergistic benefits. There's also an analgesic effect that's associated with shockwave therapy that lasts a few days. So we have to both see how that can be beneficial, but also be wary of potentially when you shockwave an animal, they feel better because of that analgesic effect. We want to make sure that they're not overdoing it in the short term. And this has become, an area of concern in horse racing. We want to make sure that the machine is used appropriately. We are all about taking care of animals. As I like to say that, that we love animals and we love people that love animals, and we want to, kind of be as beneficial as we can in that market, in the veterinary market.
And Adrian, tell me about the machines. So I'm just thinking now as a vet rehabber, and there are a lot of indications, and we're going to go through that a little bit later. And what I love about it is often it treats often the things that we struggle with. So we'll go through those all those conditions. But if you get one of these machines, I'm trying to think now. Say for example, somewhere here in South Africa, what is the type of service that we would need to do to those machines? So those machines, do they have to be serviced quite regularly? And how does that work with you guys based in the States? So I'm thinking now anyone, not just South Africa, it could be somebody in Europe.
Well, let's step back a little bit. So, first of all, shockwave therapy is an energy-based modality. And it's sound energy, right? So it's a shockwave is actually a very high energy, high impulse blast of sound energy. It's sort of like the result of an explosion, right? Think in terms of a good example is thunder is a shockwave, right? A sonic boom is a shockwave. So we're creating this high energy, very rapid rise in pressure, which moves through tissue. So you look at the various different energy modalities, whether it's therapeutic ultrasound or therapeutic laser or shockwave, right? They have kind of different strengths and weaknesses. And so first is, where would we use shockwave and why is it, it's kind of a different modality than some of those other energy-based modalities? Because I think, therapeutic ultrasound, laser therapy, radial pressure wave, they all have kind of various applicabilities and usefulnesses, but they tend to be a bit more conservative. Our kind of shockwave therapy is a pretty intense experience. You said you felt it yourself, right? And it can actually be painful at times, depending on what you're treating. But it's because there's a pretty large amount of energy, and because it's sound energy, it can go deep into the body as well. So without tracking off too much, we're able to do things that more conservative modalities can't get to. So I often say that we're sort of positioned in between a rehab modality and a surgery modality, which means we need to present it right. Otherwise, the rehab vets will say, well, that's a good surgical tool, and the surgeons will say that's a good rehab tool. We're kind of in the middle, right? But if you look at some of the early research that's been done in human medicine, plantar fasciitis is a common one, right? It's a chronic heel pain. About 90% of all plantar fasciitis cases are resolved with conservative modality, but there's still 10% that aren't, and that's when shockwave can be a really good modality to kind of kickstart the healing and increase localized vascularization, and basically to heal this condition, which if conservative modalities aren't helping with, then your next option is surgery. And surgery, has so many potential problems associated with it. It's quite extreme for the condition that you're trying to treat. Now, as far as service goes, the device and the trodes, they tend to be well, the device itself lasts a long time without any kind of service whatsoever. But the trodes do need to be replaced every so often, because they're basically, it's like the spark plug in a car that's creating this initial blast of energy. And like spark plugs, they wear out. So basically it works out to about every 50 treatments, then you have to return the trodes for replacement. And we just do that, shipping back and forth to the States. I mean, I think it can be a bit of a challenge in some markets because of import duties, and which is why it's nice to have a distributor that can help manage those import and export situations. But in today's kind of global economy, for the most part, unless there's horrible tariffs being loaded by governments, having trade wars, we can get things back and forth, and generally speaking, we can get repairs in and out of here in a couple of days. Trode refurbishments, the way that works is when you get kind of low in your pulse count, you'll call us and say, I'm low on pulse count. You order a new trode, we send a new trode to you, and then you send back the old one when it's depleted. But it works out, it works very smoothly across the world.
Okay, so it's every 50 treatments. You said generally you need to replace that.
Right.
Okay. And so you have the ProPulse, and then you also have the Versatron. Mm-hmm. So from what I can see, the ProPulse is a lot smaller and it's mobile, but it's still quite powerful. Tell me a little bit more about those two and what the differences of those products.
Yeah, so when we first took over the business in 2006, our main sort of workhorse device was the Versatron. The one before that was called the Equitron. It was about the size of a table, so it was not terribly portable. But as with a lot of things, technologies have enabled us to shrink things down and still generate a substantial amount of power. So we were working with the Versatron, which I think globally is the industry standard for shockwave therapy in horses. We were able to work with a research company based in Germany to help develop our new device, which came out in about 3 years ago now, the ProPulse. So the ProPulse is considerably smaller. It's about half the size of the Versatron, and that's a great feature of these devices in general, especially for equine practices, is that a lot of vets are putting them in their truck or their car and taking them to wherever they're going to do work. So being mobile is an important feature. Additionally, we tuned the ProPulse to match the Versatron, because we wanted to make sure that all the clinical evidence that we had generated with Versatron was going to be applicable to the new machine. But because the new machine is actually more powerful, we were able to put 2 additional higher power settings on the machine. We were also able to increase the pulse count. So, I said a general treatment is about 1,000 pulses. And our former device, we could do up to 6 pulses a second, 360 pulses a minute. So it's about a 3-minute treatment. And now we can go up to 480 pulses a minute. So it's, and you might think that's not such a big deal, but after 2 or 3 minutes of holding the trode and trying to move it around on a horse's foot while you're holding the horse's foot up, it's actually makes a difference. In addition, we've got some nice, excuse me, we have some nice customer user interface features. You can see it behind me here. The screen flips up, so you can see the screen when you're a few feet away from it. We have some preset values that you can see in here for various size dogs and horses, and for various indications. So we break it out and preset values into bone indications, tendon and ligament, chronic pain, and chronic wound healing. And then the last thing I like to point out is that the old Versatron used to have a foot pedal that you'd have to step on. So again, if you think you're holding the trode, you're holding the horse's leg, you're stepping on the pedal, it's sort of shockwave yoga, right? And not everybody's up for that. So the new one, we have just a Bluetooth button which turns on and off the machine on the handpiece. So it's a little bit easier that way.
Okay, and so, I mean, just describing how you're doing that with a horse, I mean, do you need to sedate the horse and dogs in order to be able to do it? Because when I had it done, like, I am a little bit of a wimp, so it might be why, but it was super sore. Like, I actually thought, wow, like, I don't know how long I could handle it. So, I mean, I think it must have been about 10 seconds, and then I was
And that
like,
was
oh
enough,
no.
right?
So it was on my wrist.
Mhm.
So I mean, maybe there's certain areas that are more sensitive, but it was pretty sore, I must say.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So it does. It stings. I mean, and it's an odd feeling as well. Generally speaking, horses will tolerate most treatments, without sedation. Generally speaking, if it's a lower limb, if it's over bone or on their foot, or if it's a particularly sore area, then sedation is a good idea. But I think with most equine practitioners now, they sort of they know the sense of the horse and kind of where they need to sedate, or maybe they just use a twitch or or something along those lines. Additionally, because of the analgesic effect, you can start off doing some pulses at the lower energy setting and slow. It gets the animals used to the noise and also used to the sensation, and then that analgesic effect can kick in a little bit, and then you can increase increase the dose or the energy setting to avoid that. But that being said, now mostly we want to sedate dogs. It depends on the indication again, but they tend to not handle it as well. I think it's a lot of it has to do with the experience of the vet and the breed of the dog, even. Um, uh, you know,
mm,
I always tell people that we have vets who do it without sedation all the time, and my sort of personal feeling is if it was my dog, I'd probably want them sedated because it's upsetting. It is a little painful. It's not intolerable pain, but it's quite uncomfortable. Um, so I think it's important to sort of understand that going into it. Um, but that being said, a light sedation, either something you can quickly reverse or something that wears off quickly is appropriate.
and the treatments are like every sort of 2 weeks or every week.
And so it depends on the indication, as with a lot of things. So if a tendon and ligament healing or bone healing, generally every 2 weeks for 2 to 3 treatments, but you can sort of see the progress of the condition. Tendon and ligament healing, almost always 2 to 3 treatments, 2 to 3 weeks apart. Chronic back pain can be just one treatment because you might be just trying to break the cycle of pain and get the horse doing something, for a rehab condition. So they have a sore back or a stiff, sort of part of their back. We from one end to the other, so from the pole all the way down to the tail. And frequently, what we'll see is the rider knows that there's something off about the horse, and it's not very obvious, where the lameness is from. So we could do actually diagnostically. You can take a low energy and slowly go down the horse's back and see sensitive areas, and then focus in on those areas to get a really nice result, breaking the little pain cycle of that stiff area, and the horse ends up doing a lot better for their clients. Excuse me.
Do you need some water?
I've got a little coffee here, so.
Yeah. So what I love about it, if you look at all the indications and the type of cases, it's usually those tricky cases that we often have sort of poor outcomes. So sometimes they work conservatively, sometimes we have to have surgery, and sometimes, the conservator is not working, the owner's not prepared to go for surgery. So things like ligaments and tendons, biceps tendinopathies, and like fractures, non-healing fractures is something that we can use. So I love it that it's for those tricky cases. So this is quite a good modality to be able to use. So I thought maybe we could chat a little bit about the research, because there's quite a lot of research around shockwave therapy and looking at these different types of conditions. So I thought maybe we could start chatting about the TPLOs. So I know that there has been some research that they did, and conveniently they actually do it post-operatively. So they do shockwave post-operatively, and then 2 weeks later at the post-op check, and there were some improvements in the weight bearing of the dogs, and improvements of the healing of the osteotomy sites. Can you chat to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we have done now 3 or 4 different areas around TPLO, and we initially started doing research in TPLOs because it makes a good model, right? I mean, you're doing an osteotomy, you're changing the biomechanics of the dog's knee, and all of these things make for good models. So the earliest paper that was presented, it wasn't really about TPLO, but it was a TPLO model, and it was Alan Cross was the vet here in the Atlanta area who put the study together, looking at shockwaving dogs in the patella ligament at 4 weeks and 6 weeks post-op, because he wanted to see that that we were doing something, and we were able to statistically show in a controlled study that we could decrease the amount of patella ligament desmitis. And again, that's not such a horrible clinical problem, but it does show that Shockwave is benefiting the patella ligament during this transition phase where you're biomechanically changing the dog's knee. The second study we did was for bone healing, osteotomy healing. And kind of, again, it's a nice model. You're cutting the bone, you're doing something where you can have a controlled series of dogs. Half of them we shockwave and half we don't shockwave. But we were able to show that basically an improved radiographic evidence of healing in those dogs. So in the more recent study that's just was published about 2 months ago, showed that, again, going back to that analgesic effect and also sort of the healing, that we did shockwave at the time of surgery, and at the 2-week point, the dogs were more weight bearing than in the control group. And all of this has sort of come together now. It's sort of, we see, and also because we know long-term we can benefit osteoarthritis, and all these TPLO dogs end up with osteoarthritis. I mean, the idea is to delay that, but it still ends up happening. So now we've got a pretty good little body of evidence that shows we accelerate bone healing, we reduce post-op pain, we accelerate the patella ligament remodeling, and long-term we know we reduce osteoarthritis. So it's a nice little adjunct to add at the time of surgery. Then the other piece was just a small case series that was presented from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, which is obviously a big rehab center. But Marty Drum there just did the small case series where she had some dogs that had delayed unions or delayed healing of the TPLO, and was able to, with one shockwave treatment, basically to accelerate that bone healing to get the dog fully healed. So all those things are kind of nice, right? You mentioned the ligament healing. That was sort of what led you into this before we started talking about TPLO. But some of the earliest research in horses, primarily done by a guy named Scott McClure, who was originally at Purdue and then at Iowa State, now in private practice, but he was sort of a guru of doing shockwave research early on. And he was able to show that for suspensory ligaments, the healing, the shockwave healing was not only faster healing, but it also ended up with better fiber alignment, so that basically it was a better quality of healing as well as faster healing. Then we were able to, once we started focusing a little bit more on small animal research, we have 2 publications, which are retrospective reviews of shockwave used for various shoulder indications. So you mentioned supraspinatus specifically, but there's a lot of different sort of shoulder instability and sort of understanding what the diagnosis is and trying to treat various tendon and ligament problems that can be very chronic and very hard to heal or hard to see improvement on. And we're very proud to have kind of led the research on all that. I mean, I would say that because of my human background and sort of the need in human medicine to really prove things out before you can bring them to market, I always just felt that was a real emphasis for our company, was that if we could show clinical evidence of these things, I often say that it's sort of a double-edged sword in veterinary medicine, that you can bring products to market very quickly, which means it's great because you can get it out there, but it also means that some things that maybe don't have such great efficacy could get on the market, and if they got a good guy selling it, then it gets into the marketplace and maybe is valuable, but maybe not as valuable as it could be. So we really want to stand behind it with clinical evidence. I mean, to that end, we've partnered with a lot of great teaching hospitals, folks who are interested in supporting the kind of research that we want to do, and we're all about that. So.
I mean, is this something that they use quite often in humans? So I'm trying to think back now to when I was doing sports and canoeing and running, and it was never something that really was offered to me when I had a ligament or tendon. I mean, I had plantar fasciitis for a long time. It was really bad. And it wasn't something that I was offered, but is it something that, in the human field, people are being treated a lot using Shockwave for all
yes,
these
and not as much as we would like, or hope. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are a lot of different kinds of Shockwave generators that are on the market. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of research done in insertional tendinopathies in human medicine, and there was actually FDA approval, a PMA approval, so a pretty extensive level of approval for plantar fasciitis and for lateral epicondylitis or tennis elbow. So these are, two cases where conservative modalities work for a lot of cases, but about 10 or 15% of the time it doesn't. And in those chronic cases, Shockwave was shown to work quite well, but it was a very specific. It was our kind of Shockwave. So without going into too much background, you may know that Shockwave therapy has been around since the 1980s, used to break up kidney stones or lithotripsy, right? So when you're breaking up a kidney stone, you want to focus energy at a really tiny spot in the body, and basically not try and put a lot of Shockwave energy outside of where the kidney stone actually is. We don't want to blast the kidney with Shockwave energy. We just want to hit the stone, right? So some of the early research took the kind of device that we have, which has a very large energy in a large focal area, right? So you're actually treating an area and focusing energy into an area about the size of my little finger, right? So much, much bigger than a kidney stone would be. So it was determined kind of what level of energy per area was required to break up a kidney stone, and then also what kind of energy per area would be too much and potentially cause damage. And the machines then were sort of matched, and different technologies came out to have a small focal area that would blast that little kidney stone area. Now that's great for kidney stones, but in the orthopedic space, it turns out that the much larger energy in much larger area were much more suited for those kind of indications. But the companies that had made these other devices with small focal areas and small energies kind of persisted into the sports medicine areas, and their research wasn't so good in some of these indications. So two things really happened. One was that Shockwave was overutilized for non-chronic cases where it should have been more the conservative modalities. And then the other thing was that there was a bunch of papers coming out saying, well, some of these Shockwave machines aren't so good in these sports medicine indications. So the insurance companies looked at that and said, well, maybe we shouldn't cover for this. And then so initially there was reimbursement for Shockwave therapy for plantar fasciitis and tennis elbow, but then it started to get retracted. Now, 10 years later, they're starting to look at Shockwave therapy on the human side for much more indications. So it's being used in, experimented with in cardiac tissue, for example, for following heart attacks. Can we regenerate the myocardium and kind of rebuild heart muscle back following a heart attack? Diabetic foot ulcers, I mentioned, is why we split out from Sanuwave in the first place. So that Sanuwave now has FDA approval for treating diabetic foot ulcers, and they're establishing reimbursement data. But I think the key thing is, and it's very important to understand this, is that the different Shockwave generators have very different levels of efficacy. And it's why it's important, if you're looking at getting a Shockwave machine, you really should do your homework. This goes back to what I was saying about bringing products to market easily. You really want to make sure that you're looking at the right kind of device. I mean, all these machines work a little bit here and there, but again, we're really proud of the fact that we've done a lot of research and shown kind of the best level of efficacy at a very wide variety of indications, and we continue to explore other new indications as we go.
So the foot ulcers is so interesting. So it's obviously the angiogenic factors that are released,
right,
on that stimulation, and that is because you can also use it for wound healing, can't you? I mean, I've seen some pictures of some amazing, like, hectic wounds, and after 2 or 3 weeks, the wound is contracted, it's got beautiful granulation tissue, and that's obviously the same thing. And how do you do that? Are you basically putting like a sterile glove over the chode directly onto the wound?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, the basically, this is sound energy. So you want to put ultrasound gel on the trode head, so you have very good conduction of the sound energy into the body. But when you have a nasty wound that you're trying to put it on top of, you need to make sure that everything's sterile. You don't want to get the trode messed up. You don't want to put anything infectious in the field. So using sterile gel, and I generally recommend that you just take a sterile glove and cut a section out of it and put gel on the trode head, then the sterile glove, and then more gel on the other side.
And what about elbow dysplasia? Because that's another one of those tricky cases. So we have those cases that are diagnosed young, they have elbow dysplasia, they get osteoarthritis in their elbows, and it's one of those kind of things that we really just have to manage. And there is some studies that have been done in dogs suffering from elbow dysplasia and Shockwave. Can we chat about that?
Yeah, so osteoarthritis, generated, there's the actual cause, and then there's the symptoms of the cause, right? So, Shockwave isn't doing anything about changing the biomechanics of the elbow. If there is any kind of calcification, Shockwave can help break that up. But basically, what we see is a reduction in chronic pain, and there's sort of two pieces to that. One is that initial analgesic effect, which can allow additional rehabilitation to go on. And then the other piece of that is that Shockwave has been shown to down-regulate some of the inflammatory cytokines that are associated with accelerating osteoarthritis. So, one of the challenges is that we end up being used for osteoarthritis as sort of the last thing, we've tried everything else, nothing's working, these are end-stage dogs. So we have shown that we can provide a benefit to those dogs, and sometimes that lasts a year, and sometimes it only lasts a few months, right? So that's a little bit of the, when do you want to, resort to Shockwave for an osteoarthritis case? I think there's a compelling argument to be made that the earlier the better, right? Because you're down regulating some of these inflammatory cytokines that can lead to accelerating osteoarthritis. So it's not just about treating the symptom of the pain, it's also about going to sort of part of the root cause of the acceleration of osteoarthritis by down regulating some of these proteins that are associated with increasing osteoarthritis.
You also mentioned in the beginning about some exciting research regarding Shockwave and stem cells. Are you able to talk about that, or is that top secret?
Well, I think it's sort of early stages, right? But we've been asked, ever since stem cells and PRPs and things like that have become popular, what's the effect of using these two things together? And there have been a few publications, many of which we've been intimately involved with. We've done some study with Guelph in Canada and also Colorado State University, where they're looking at shockwaving stem cells in vitro and seeing what kind of effect there is. And so some of the encouraging sort of news out of that is that that Shockwave doesn't in any way damage the stem cells that are being shockwaved, and that was an obvious concern early on. But also we're seeing a propensity to remodel the stem cells towards bone cells. So sort of the promise of stem cells is that ultimately they could become either cartilage cells or bone cells, or that they could replace cells that aren't there anymore. And so in particular, if you're looking at using stem cells for a bone healing model, and shockwaving those stem cells could be add a synergistic effect. Same thing with PRP, for example, right? So we were unsure initially. We used to recommend that if you're going to use PRP and Shockwave together, which a lot of vets do, equine practitioners especially, that you would draw the blood for the PRP, then do the Shockwave treatment, and then after you've spun the PRP down, then inject it after you do the Shockwave treatment. But now it turns out that shockwaving the PRP activates the platelets at a higher rate. So there could be that synergistic benefit of getting the platelets to activate and release all the proteins, the beneficial proteins that you want working while the reason you injected PRP in the first place.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the conditions that we're treating with Shockwave, we generally are treating with PRP anyway. So the tendon issues, ligament issues, elbow dysplasia is one that often responds quite well to stem cell or PRP. Very interesting. And any other new research that is coming out that you're busy with?
Well, there's one area that I'm somewhat hesitant to talk about, but we've got an interesting opportunity. So we've always said that, I'll sort of put a disclaimer on this, that we haven't done a lot of research on this one yet, but it's promising. Is we've always said that you should avoid shockwaving lung tissue because it's fairly delicate tissue and there's a concern that you could cause potential harm. But now we have a vet who's approached me first about 3 years ago with this idea of shockwaving horse lungs when they have basically bleeders, right? The exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage indication. And so this is an interesting idea because not just for the bleeders indication itself, but if you can safely shockwave lung tissue and address a problem with the lung tissue, then potentially maybe there's an opportunity to use it for pneumonia or some other indications, both in the veterinary side and the human side. So that's an exciting opportunity that we're going to try and do some safety studies around. We first and foremost want to make sure we're not causing any harm. And I always say that too. So it's one of those things that I'm a bit passionate about is that we've treated literally millions of horses and hundreds of thousands of dogs at this point, and the worst report of any kind of complication we've ever had is a mild pain for a day or two after treatment, or mild bruising for a couple of days that resolves itself. So, it's when you're comparing using shockwave to like a surgical procedure, for example, right? The idea that if you shockwave it before you try surgery, the worst thing that happens is that you might have a little discomfort and the outcome you were looking for didn't happen, which means you haven't changed the animal biomechanically in any way, so that if you do decide to go on and do that revision surgery or whatever, you haven't changed anything that prevents you from doing that.
When you say they are a little bit sore, is it contraindicated to use non-steroidal anti-inflammatories?
I get asked this question a lot. So it's not contraindicated. That's if you look at some of the research that's been done, the osteoarthritis study that was done at the University of Tennessee, for example, almost all those dogs were on anti-inflammatory. So the way we set the study up was that if they were on NSAIDs at the start of the study, we kept them on, and if they were not on, then we wouldn't put them on, as a way of controlling variables. But most of those animals were on anti-inflammatories already. They were kind of end-stage OA dogs. And they did well as a result of using Shockwave. So on the one hand, the idea that Shockwave does promote inflammation, and usually in a good healing way, and an anti-inflammatory slows that process down. So it does seem that they would be fighting each other a little bit in those indications. But again, the results that we saw in that OA study were pretty good despite the animals being on anti-inflammatory. So I think the answer to the question is that you would prefer that they weren't on anti-inflammatories, I think, to have a better effect. But if they are, it's not a contraindication.
Interesting. Adrian, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to chat to you and your wealth of knowledge of all the research around shockwave therapy. It's been great. Thank you for your time, and thank you for all the support that you give the vet rehabbers. You guys are always out there sponsoring webinars and sponsoring CPDs and at conferences. And I think the last time we met was at the Knoxville conference, and I'm hoping to see you at 2020 in Cambridge.
Yeah, you too. I mean, we normally spend our lives halfway around the world from each other, right? So thanks very much.
Yeah.
We are very passionate about trying to help the animal health industry. It's very important to us as in our little company. So thank you.
Cheers, Adrian. Thanks so much.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Vet Rehabbers,
For more information on how to take your career to the next level, go to www.onlinepethealth.com. Please don't forget to subscribe to my podcast so you'll get notified. I'm here every single week talking to vet rehabbers from all over the world, learning, and I would love you to join me. Hope you have an awesome day further. Cheers for now.